Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Educated Collins Snap channel. How you doing? So today we will be covering surprise cards. So I kind of glanced over it in my tips and tricks videos for 400, but I finally got to it. Now we're going to be going over surprise cards, what they are, what they're used for, why you should have them, and then the types of surprise cards and just some other things relating to it. So this might be a long one. You should be used to these by now. Let's get into it. So first things first, what are surprise cards? I would say surprise cards are cards that usually are unexpected to your opponent and can turn around a losing game. So these cards, when played, you should be like, "Oh, I forgot about this, or I didn't realize he could do this." And a game that your opponent thought they were ahead, these cards can turn the game around and make you the winner. So that's essentially what they do and why they're so good. So surprise cards are one of the best ways to gain 8 cube wins off of opponents. So the reason this is the case is because usually how people work, how humans kind of play this game, is they will not really want to risk things, right? If they are behind, they're going to leave. So essentially, you have to bait them into a situation where they think they're ahead, but because you have cards of these qualities in your hand, you let them overextend, let them snap into you, whatever, and then turn 6, you play these surprise cards. They go, "Wow, I forgot about this," or "Wow, I didn't realize, oh, he could do this." And you actually get the 8 cubes. So these are definitely one of the best ways to gain 8 cubes, because usually if you're like dominating a game, people are not going to stay, people are going to leave. So it's only when a game is close, it's only when you can turn a game around, is when you can actually get them to continue playing the game, get them to finish the game out, and take those 8 cubes. So very useful type of card to have. So this is kind of explaining it. Most people usually stay in the game if they have a powerful game plan, and surprise cards can turn those game plans into weaknesses. So let's say, they want to summon big things. Well, if you have a Shang-Chi, bam, you can just blow them out. If they want to flood the board or summon tons of big powerful cards on the last turn, well, an arrow, right, could put it all in one lane so they can't really contest. If they want to, play a magic or something, you can like change the location, and oh, well, now they couldn't do their setup. So there's a ton of ways where players could be setting up for a powerful game plan, but you can use a surprise card to turn those game plans into weaknesses and take big wins off of them. So one core concept is that every card can be or become a surprise card. So a surprise card isn't necessarily they have to destroy a card, or they have to do something special. Every card can be a surprise card. Surprise cards are just cards that your opponent doesn't expect, right? Where it makes your opponent like, "Oh, I didn't realize they would play this, or they're running this." They don't actually have to do anything fancy. As long as your opponent's not really expecting that card, that's essentially a surprise card. Now, that doesn't mean that every card has the same properties of surprise. Like a Scarlet Witch can do a lot more than like a zero, or something that just gives stats, right? The there are different levels of surprise cards, but I wouldn't say, "Oh, this card doesn't do anything special, it's not a surprise card." As long as your opponent's caught off guard and it can change a game around, that can be a surprise card. We're definitely going to go over types of surprise cards later down the road, but it should be said that just because it doesn't fit any noticeable box, it doesn't mean it's not a surprise card. As long as you're catching people off guard, that's the whole purpose of a surprise card. It's not like, oh, it has to be this or that. So, in that same vein, a card that is traditionally thought of being a surprise card can actually stop being one if it becomes meta, if it becomes expected, right? Like a very common card is Shang-Chi, right? If you know the deck list, you're like, oh, they could be playing Shang-Chi. That means that that card has really lost its surprise value. It's now more of just a tool that everyone's aware of. So now you're like, well, if he Shang-Chi's me, at least I can do this to counteract the Shang-Chi. Oh, it's 3 power here. At least I can just play a 4 power card. So even if he Shang-Chi's me, well, I still have this 4 power to deal with it. So cards that become meta, become commonplace, cards you logically think about commonly when you're playing a game, if that is happening, that card has really lost its value of that surprise mechanic. So if you think in your games, oh, they could have this or that or whatever, well, those cards you're thinking of are not surprising well because it's a common thought that you could have. So Arrow, Leader, when it was very popular, Shang-Chi, Enchantress, da da da, all those cards at the highest levels really stop being surprise cards and just tools that people play around. So that's something you have to grasp. You can't just say, oh, this is always going to be my surprise card. A meta can change, player bases can change, things like that. And it doesn't always mean that a card that maybe last season was a surprise card, this season could just be a common tool that people are playing around. Now, got a question for you guys. What is the worst type of deck list? So, pause for a little bit, just think about it for yourself, and try to figure out with this concept what would be a really bad deck list to play. Now, the answer I have for you guys is a predictable and popular deck list. So just being predictable isn't actually that bad if it's a niche deck list, right? If it's a deck list people aren't playing, then that predictability doesn't really affect too many of your games because people won't really know what is he running. Like if every time your game plan is to I play this card on 4 and then I always play this card on 5 and I always play this card on 6, right? That makes a deck very predictable. So when a deck is both predictable and popular, then when you play that deck list, they're like, well, he's going to play this card on 4. He's going to play this card on 5. He's going to play this card on 6. And even if the deck list is strong, the problem is that they know how the game is going to turn out. So they can always decide whether to stay or to leave. So that means if they're staying, you should be scared. And if they're leaving, well, you're not getting that much reward from playing that deck list. So every time you're building a deck or you're thinking about a deck design, are these cards popular? Are these cards predictable? Is my game plan predictable? Or will my opponent know exactly what I'm trying to do every game that I play this? And if the answer is yes, then you have to really evaluate whether this is the type of deck you want to be using, especially for climbing. Tournament play is a little different beast, but we're not going into that for now. So generally for climbing, for ladder, if a deck is predictable, you always do the same things on the same turns, that's pretty bad. And it's only bad if it's popular, if people know what you're doing. So you could run a very random list that no one runs, but you do the same thing every time because no one actually knows what you're doing. It can be super effective, at least for while it's still niche. But as soon as someone picks it up, a streamer plays it, blah blah blah, then boom, like all that power is lost. So you really have to be careful with that. So because of that, neck deck builds and complete meta lists are notoriously bad for having surprise factors because any net deck build is going to be super popular, super common. Any meta list builds are also going to be super common. People are going to know exactly what cards you're playing, right? They're going to know exactly your game plan. They're going to have seen that deck hundreds of times. So it's going to be hard to put anything or showcase any plays that they won't expect because it's so common, because it's so ever present. You're never going to play a card and they go like, wow, I forgot he could play that. Like they've seen it 20 times that day. So um anytime you're wanting to have this advantage, it's always cool to try to, at least at the beginning of the season, build your own decks, or take a deck and then change it a little bit, just to add that wrinkle of like, oh, this isn't exactly the complete list I thought they were running. He actually has a different card than um, is normally in these types of decks. So even doing something small like changing one card out for a different card can definitely have such a powerful effect in how like what people are confident into staying into, right? So let's say you just change a card and you put like a Doctor Doom. That doesn't really make sense. Well, they're like, okay, well he can't do this, he can't do that. But then you play the Doom and you're like, oh wait, I didn't think he could play that card. Oh, now he can actually hit this location that normally they can't hit. Blah blah blah, and you can really get these 8 cube wins because you have something different than the standard. Because people are always like, oh, he played this, he played a Mordius. He must be playing discard, full discard. Like they have the whole list in their head. And if you change it up, well, that's how you surprise people. That's how you throw them off guard. Now, meta changes and popularities can change how a card is perceived. So basically, a card that could be a very powerful tool early in a season can slowly and slowly become less powerful, less effective, since it becomes more popular. It becomes more of the meta, and people now react to the card appropriately. They're not getting caught off guard because you're playing this card. They're now like, oh yeah, this card, that's a meta card. So just because you had a great idea like 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago or even a week ago doesn't mean it's always going to be great, right? You have to change, you have to adapt to the how players respond to your cards, to your game plan. So really understanding the ability of climb is take advantage of those moments of gaps in knowledge where you have a strategy that they don't expect, but then as soon as they start expecting that strategy, you change up your strategy, you change up your plays, you add a different surprise card, and just keep people on their toes, because it's always going to be um, a fight of like meta and counter and anti-meta, right? So the meta is gonna like dominate, and then a lot of something you can do is just run cards to deal with the meta. But if people continuously run that counter meta becomes the meta. And now you have to be like, okay, everyone's running this annoying list. How do I make that list work for me? So something very happens, like people are playing leech and leader, right? So people were losing to that, and then that became the standard game plan. And people are like, okay, how do I make leech and leader work for me? Oh, let me put Infinite. Let me put cards that leader doesn't work well with. Let me play a destroyer. Just if they play that leader into my destroyer, I'm killing. That kind of thing, right? And that became like the new tool to deal with the meta. But that was a response to the counter meta that was created because people were playing that to deal with the previous meta. So you always have to be changing, you always have to be evolving. It's not a like, this is my deck for the year, I'm just playing that nonstop. That can work, right? Depending on the deck, depending on how powerful it is. That can be very useful or efficient in very busted metas where there's this like super powerful card. But in healthy metas, usually a meta will happen and then a counter meta will appear, and then a counter meta to the counter meta will appear, and it keeps like overflowing as you try to find cool ways to one up or make an efficient counter to the previous week or day's meta. So you really want to have one or more surprise cards in every deck, just because it's one of the core ways to climb quickly. It's one of the core ways to get tons of cubes off of people. Just throwing people for a loop, playing a card they're not expecting in your deck, and just like being like, oh, that Omega Red was really good here, right? Like that kind of thing. Those are really how you get people to stay in because they don't know they don't expect you to do these type of plays, and that can catch them off guard, get you those wins, and really help you climb. So definitely, I personally recommend that you run one or more. It's sometimes hard to run like tons of them because you do need like a core deck build to that is strong and powerful, but having those twists can really be the difference maker. All right, now we're gonna go over some types of surprise cards. There's different uh, things that surprise cards like to do, different themes that they gravitate towards. But another thing is you always want to consider snapping before playing a surprise card. So this is just like it's not like a something you have to do, but it's something I think is helpful to think about anytime you have like your surprise card in your hand and you want to play it. Just consider, should I snap here? Can this change the flow of a match, right? If he gets caught off guard, if your Chang-Chi goes off, if you get to play your big minion, if your Jubilee hits an Infinite, right? Would you have wanted to snap before that action happened? So it's always a good idea to consider snapping before you play your surprise card, just so that you get a advantage from playing it. So the first type of surprise cards are cheap stats. So these are just cards that you can play for cheap. Death, She-Hulk, Miles Morales, Stature when it comes out, Quinjet. So these cards these cards are either played very cheaply if done correctly, or can make other cards very cheap. So they're just a good tool, something to think about. We're not gonna like go over every single card, but these are just the types of them. Next one, you have unexpected stats. So these aren't cheap stats, but these are stats where you're like, you have these ideas of breakpoints in your head, like, oh, turn 6, he can play Magneto, that's 12 power. And then they play a Giganto on you instead, and you're like, oh, right, he could actually play 14 here, so I actually lose by 2 or 1 or whatever instead of the 12 you were thinking. Same thing with like M'Baku. Same thing with like Titania. It's 1 power for 5. Turn 6, you can play that, and that can like really throw people off guard. If you do something like Arrow plus Titania, you get 5 in the lane, and you get you move all the other cards. So things like that. Infinite's kind of like on the line of surprise, because if you pass turn 5, you're like, well, okay, I guess he's doing something, right? So that one's a little bit less of a surprise, but you could pull this out from maybe a Jubilee or a Lockjaw or something, and that could be unexpected. And speaking of those cards, those type of cards, we have the RNG positive stats. So these are cards that are RNG in nature, but usually your deck is skewed for these cards to be positive, right? So even though, oh yeah, you could hit your Wasp or whatever, normally, if you look at the odds, every time you play this card, you should have a positive outcome in RNG. So these are a surprise card, because once again, you don't even know who you're gonna get. But since the deck is tuned for these cards to be positive for you, they end up being a good card normally to play to catch people off guard, things like that. Next up, we have card generation. Card generation makes a ton of sense why it's a surprise card. You don't even know what you're going to get, so they don't know what you're going to get, and you can really just catch people off guard playing like random Valkyries out of nowhere, playing like a Shang-Chi like out of nowhere, a Dino in a non-Dino deck, but you have a full hand. These kinds of things. So just a good way of surprising people if you generate cards that you don't have in your deck. Next up, we have the location changers. These ones are really powerful because you can turn a bad location to a good location. You can close down a location. You can extend the game. You can swap them, right? So these ones do a lot of work. They're pretty obvious in how they can be powerful, how they can be a surprise, and it's really up to you which ones you like the most. As you guys know, I'm a Scarlet Witch fan, but I think Storm and Magic and the others really do a very similar job. Next up, we have card movement. So these cards move other cards on either your board or your opponent's board. So Arrow is like a premium card, one of the best cards in the game because you can move all the opponent's cards into one lane, lock that down. Magneto, same thing. You can move a ton of their cards into one lane. Heimdall is also really powerful because, they think you're fighting for one lane. Oh, no, you're actually fighting for the other two lanes, and can really catch you off guard if they think, I could play nothing there because they're not really contesting it. And Juggernaut, a nice, powerful card where you can just play like Storm and then Juggernaut right afterwards. And if they can't really affect that, you get a free lane. So really powerful being able to move cards, yours or your opponent's. Hand disruption, annoy your opponent in the hand, right? Before they even get to play their card, you can mess with them, discard them, blackboard, silence them, stop them from drawing, and pulling them down into the game. So this can be a really powerful way of surprising people if they're thinking, I have this card that will win me the game, and you just say, no, that card doesn't do anything, or that card's already on the board, I'm discarding it, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, really, really powerful tool. Next up, with hand disruption, we have lane disruption. So cards like Debris, Green Goblin, Hobgoblin, Viper, these cards can be really powerful because you just stop your opponent from activating the combos they want to do with the space provided. So this can be really cool into things like Space Throne. I've definitely Debris into a Space Throne, and then they have a rock there and they can't do nothing. But I have ways to buff that rock so it doesn't actually affect me that much. So things like that can be pretty powerful. So just taking advantage, and there's whole decks built around this type of mechanic. So it definitely has its place in the metagame, and just definitely can be a powerful tool that you can use to mess with your opponent. I will say a lot of these surprise cards are annoying, right? Like they are annoying, but they're annoying because they're effective. They're annoying because they create that feeling of like, if he didn't have that one card, I would have got him, right? And that's really how you get those AQs, right? Because they're overconfident. They think that you have nothing to deal with their situation, but you can play these cards, turn the game around, surprise them, and get them really considering all the different avenues that players can deal with these unusual situations or very powerful board states. Let me get some water real quick. Next up, we have trap cards. So this one is almost another video in itself, but these are essentially just cards that absolutely shut down an opponent's win condition. So usually they'll have there's like a telegraphed game plan, like I'm playing all these ongoings, or I'm playing all these huge minions, or whatever, etc., etc. Shang-Chi can be a trap card. And then you play this one card, and it completely shuts down their whole game plan. You blow it up, you erase their effects, you steal their effects, blah, blah, blah. And their huge game plan, their huge play, you turn that around, you turn it into a weakness. So these cards can be very game-changing, very strong, and definitely a lot of decks are built with a couple of these in their main slots. Enchantress is a common card. Shang-Chi is a common card. Even Cosmo, right, can be a trap card in the right situation. So these cards just do a lot of work and can really turn the tide of a match. Next up, we have destruction cards. So these are cards that blow up other cards. Very strong, very powerful, obviously. Killing cards from your opponent can really mess with them, mess with their game plan, and they're pretty clear-cut in how good they are and how they can turn a game around. Next up, we have Lockdown. So Lockdown is just shutting down your opponent's game plan, not letting them do what they want to do. So Professor X, Spider-Man, you just lock down their lane. Sandman could be a nice lockdown card because they only get to play one card if they want to flood. Cosmo can be really annoying if you lock down one lane, Cosmo the other. Well, they can't play any of their on reveals anymore, and that can be really powerful. So that's pretty cool. Then Goose just prevents these 4, 5, 6 high cost cards from being played. So that can also just mess with people's flows, mess with people's game plans. So definitely really nice type of surprise and really can just shut down an opponent's game plan completely. Now, if we have lockdown, we have access, lockdown access, right? So even though a location may be flooded, right, you could still get to it with some of these cards. Marvel, Doctor Doom, Heimdall again, Mr. Fantastic. Just being able to say, okay, yeah, I know the lane's locked down, but that doesn't mean I can't influence that lane completely. I can still do a little bit of work. So these are just nice countermeasure tools to mess with the opponent's game plan of locking you down. Next up, we have the power buffer. So these cards just buff up cards. They're not too complicated. They just kind of say, okay, you think that I have this much power here. Well, now I go Killmonger Nova. I have significantly more power here. I go Spectrum, or I go Blue Marvel, or I go Luke Cage, even with Hazmat, things like that, and I just mess with the power that you were expecting to be on those lanes. So they can be a nice surprise in the right tools. Usually, sometimes power buffers are just played down willy nilly, but you can actually use them as a finisher to sneak extra power that your opponent's not expecting. And then last but not least, at least for now, we have the full lane influence. So these are cards that can influence lanes that are already full. So they're kind of like a subset of power buffing, but they just increase the number of lanes that may be already full. They don't always have to be full, but they're really good at messing with someone who's like, well, he only has this much power here, but then you claw them and you're like, oh man, they got the 6 power that I wasn't expecting. Now they win that lane, and now since they win that lane, I wasn't really contesting that other lane because I thought, okay, I win that for sure. I just have to contest the mid lane. So they can just catch people off guard. I really think claws is, especially pool 2, one of the best tools for doing something like that. And there's a lot of other little ways to do that. Mr. Fantastic is a very popular card that always it's surprising how effective it can be just putting that 2 power in every lane. So definitely think these are the types of surprises you want to look at. But that doesn't mean if it wasn't in this list or it wasn't a type that those cards can't be considered surprise cards. Every card can be. It's just a lot of surprise cards can fall into these buckets of this one does this one does that. So just something to think about when you're creating decks. Like, what is my surprise? What does it do? How does it work? What situations can I play with this to really take advantage of it? And once again, always consider snapping if you can utilize a surprise card effectively. Now, last section is telegraphed cards. So these are kind of the opposite of surprise cards. Just like there are cards that have a tendency to surprise a player, there are also cards that have a tendency to telegraph your plays. So I actually don't personally like these type of cards too much. The nice thing about these cards is usually they're very powerful, right? Like they don't get played unless they're powerful, unless they can win a lane, they can do a ton of unique mechanics. So they tend to be very strong. The only problem, at least for me, for thinking about it from a climbing standpoint, is when you play these cards down, people tend to leave because they're so telegraphed. They're like, well, if he does this, I lose. So I'm not gonna test it. I'm just gonna leave. So you don't usually get 8 cubes from these type of cards, but they are still good. They have their uses, and they don't always have to be played in a telegraphed way, right? If you can manipulate the mana cost, or if you can play it early or later, or blah blah blah, you can really turn these into surprise cards because you're playing them in an unusual way. But let's go through some of the examples I have here. So we have Storm, right? If I play a Storm in an empty lane, what's being telegraphed, right? Maybe I'm about to play a juggernaut or whatever, but it basically means I'm probably going to contest that lane, right? So it's telegraphing my next turn. And that can be um, pretty interesting in how your opponents want to deal with that telegraph nature of your play, right? Do they want to also contest? Do they want to ignore that lane? Do they want to uh, bait a contest and then actually deal with it in a later date? Do they want to counter, change the location, blah blah blah? There's a lot of ways, but it by playing the story, you're telegraphing you're about to do something on that lane most of the time. So you do have to be careful with that. Wong's a notorious noob crusher, but the more you play, the more weaknesses you see with Wong, where people just say, "Oh, you play the Wong? Well, I have a Cosmo. You play the Wong? Well, I'm gonna error. You play the Wong? Well, I'm gonna, do another way to mess with the card." So it's just a card that telegraphs a place, and if things go wrong horribly, right? Like if they Cosmo your Wong, well, that can be the difference between you winning 8 cubes or you losing 8 cubes. So that's another scary thing about telegraph cards. If they know how to play around the telegraph nature of those cards, you can be baited into snapping, and then they can bait you into playing for 4 keys, playing for 8 cubes, that kind of thing, and it can be really scary. Shuri, right? Even though Shuri is an amazing card and I think the best card in the game, I still think it's telegraphed because anytime you play a Shuri, what's coming afterwards? You know what's coming afterwards. A big boy, a big a big girl. Something is coming that's gonna be a big chunky. So, you can do things like Shang-Chi preemptively, right? Like, oh, I know they're playing something that's Shang-Chiable. Let me already just blow it up. Or I know they're going to be doing something with Zola or something with Taskmaster, so I need to prepare for that. So you just set up these telegraph windows whenever you play a Shuri. Even though Shuri is amazing, it's still a telegraph card. So even though cards can be super strong, it doesn't mean that they don't have weaknesses, they don't have ways to deal around it, they're not obvious to play with. So you just have to be careful. And then Galactus, right? So Galactus very telegraphed. If you play Galactus early, well, I guess you've lost, right? You may as well leave. Oh, a null's coming. Oh, they Doctor Octopus, your whole hand, and now they Galactus you. I guess I should leave. Oh, they play the Wolverine. Oh, I wonder what's coming next, right? So, the whole deck list is just telegraph card next to telegraph card next to telegraph card. Like, they're screaming Galactus at you the whole time. So, it's kind of interesting that the whole deck is basically a telegraphed deck list, but it's still really strong when it works, right? Like, it's like even though you know what's coming, you might not be able to deal with it, and that just goes to show you like how powerful some of these telegraph cards can be. And if you just don't have decks that can really deal with that, like you don't Cosmo correctly or something like that, it can just be a bad or a non-fun experience. So you have to be careful with these things. But essentially, that's all I got for you guys. Kind of a full breakdown of surprise cards, a full breakdown of what they do, why you should have them, the types, and just fully understanding why these are an important part of the metagame. So hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.